The unexpected verdict. The courtroom was silent, a heavy tension filling the air. Sarah Thompson sat nervously in the defendant's chair, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly together. The judge, a stern and emotionless man named Judge Roberts, sat high above them, his eyes scanning the room with a cold and calculating gaze. Sarah had been through countless trials in her life, but this one was different. This was her chance to prove her innocence, but something about the way the judge had been acting during the trial made her uneasy. Sarah had been accused of a crime she didn't commit. It was a simple misunderstanding, a case of bad timing and unfortunate circumstances. But despite the evidence in her favor, the prosecutor had been ruthless, presenting half-truths and misleading statements. Judge Roberts had been more than willing to accept them. Throughout the trial, he had shown no compassion or understanding. He seemed set on making an example of her. It wasn't lost on Sarah that the judge had a reputation for being tough on people of color, and many had whispered about his bias. She tried not to let it get to her, but she couldn't help but wonder if that was why the trial had been so unfair. Her lawyer, a woman named Mia, had worked tirelessly to defend her. Mia was smart, passionate, and determined. But even Mia was starting to show signs of exhaustion. The case had dragged on for weeks, and the pressure of going up against a powerful prosecutor and a biased judge was wearing everyone down. "Sarah Thompson, please rise," Judge Roberts said, his voice booming across the room, breaking the silence. Sarah stood, her knees shaking, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had to stay strong. For her children, for her family. The judge's eyes fixed on her, cold and unyielding. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing both sides, I have reached my decision," he announced. "Sarah Thompson, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Life in prison. The room seemed to spin around her as she fought to keep her composure. She had prepared herself for the worst, but she hadn't expected this. A life sentence. No chance of ever seeing her children again. No hope of freedom. How could this be happening? Sarah felt her chest tighten as the reality of the situation sank in. The courtroom was in complete silence. No one moved. Her lawyer, Mia, looked as though she had been struck too, her face pale and her mouth slightly open in shock. Sarah's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to argue, to tell everyone that this wasn't fair, that she didn't deserve this. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, paralyzed by disbelief. The bailiff moved toward her, signaling that it was time to take her away. Sarah didn't resist. She didn't know what to do. Her mind was in a haze, and her body felt heavy as if the weight of the entire world had just been placed on her shoulders. As the bailiff led her toward the back door of the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of her children in the audience. They were sitting with her mother, their faces full of worry and confusion. She wanted to call out to them, to tell them it would be okay, but she couldn't. They didn't deserve to see her like this. As Sarah was escorted out of the courtroom, the reporters in the hallway began to shout questions at her. Flashbulbs popped, capturing every moment. But she kept her head down, trying to block out the noise. She just needed to get away from the crowd, away from everything that had just happened. But as she made her way through the back door, something unexpected happened. The doors suddenly swung open, and in walked her husband, John Thompson, the mayor of the city. His presence in the courtroom was enough to stop everyone in their tracks. People gasped as they saw him, his tall frame and confident posture commanding attention. He walked toward Sarah, his eyes locked on hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. John's reputation was well known. As the mayor, he held significant power in the city, and his influence stretched far beyond the local government. He was a man who knew how to get things done, and he wasn't about to let this injustice stand. "Sarah," he said softly, taking her hand, "we're going to get through this. I won't let them do this to you." The reporters and the crowd seemed to be forgotten as John turned to face Judge Roberts. The judge, who had just sentenced Sarah to life in prison, was standing at his bench, clearly taken aback by John's sudden appearance. His face twitched, and for the first time that day, he seemed unsure of himself. "You?" Judge Roberts stammered. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here because my wife has been wronged," John said firmly. "And you, Judge Roberts, are going to answer for it." The room went silent again, this time in shock. John's words were like a challenge thrown at the judge. No one had expected this confrontation, least of all the judge, who had underestimated Sarah's family. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For a moment, he looked lost, unable to process what was happening. But Sarah knew. She knew that this was just the beginning. The judge had no idea who he had just sentenced to life in prison. And now, he was going to find out just how powerful Sarah's family truly was. The mayor's move. As Sarah was led to the holding area in the back of the courtroom, the sound of the door slamming behind her echoed in her ears. Her mind was still reeling from the sentence. Life in prison. How could this be real? Her body trembled, and she tried to steady herself. She had to keep it together. There was no room for weakness now. But then she remembered John, her husband, the mayor. When he walked into the courtroom, everything changed. The way the reporters had looked at him, the gasps from the crowd. It was clear they all recognized him. John was not just any man. He was someone with real power. He was someone who could make things happen, no matter how difficult or impossible they seemed. As Sarah sat in the holding cell, waiting to be processed, her mind was filled with thoughts of what John would do next. She couldn't see him, but she could feel his presence. The way he had looked at her with that fire in his eyes, the promise he made to get her out of this mess. Sarah didn't know exactly what he had planned, but she trusted him. She had to. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but then the sound of footsteps outside the holding cell reached her ears. She turned her head, and there he was, John. He was dressed in his suit, his tall frame cutting through the hallway like a force of nature. He wasn't alone, though. There was a man with him, someone she didn't recognize. But the way the man held himself, confident, composed, told Sarah everything she needed to know. This man was important. "Sarah," John said, stepping inside the small room. His voice was calm but firm. "We're going to get you out of here. I've already made some calls." Sarah felt her heart race as she stood up. "John, I don't understand. How can we fix this? They just sentenced me to life." John placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "I know, but we're not done. Not by a long shot. This isn't over." He turned to the man who had followed him in. "This is Derek. He's a lawyer who specializes in overturning wrongful convictions. I've already spoken to him, and he's going to help us." Derek stepped forward, offering Sarah a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Mrs. Thompson. We're going to fight this. The truth always has a way of coming out." Sarah looked between the two men, a feeling of hope slowly beginning to blossom in her chest. They were right. This wasn't over. If there was one thing Sarah knew, it was that her husband would move mountains to protect her. And if Derek was on their side, then they had a fighting chance. John's voice broke through her thoughts. "We need to act fast. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be to undo this. But I already started working behind the scenes." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Judge Roberts won't know what hit him." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She knew her husband had connections, but she never realized how far those connections went. As the mayor, he was more than just a public figure. He had influence in every corner of the city. He could pull strings, make things happen. And now, he was using that power to help her. Derek stepped forward again. "I'm going to gather all the evidence we need. We'll show that this trial was biased and unjust. We'll appeal the sentence, and I'm confident we can have it overturned." "How long will it take?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Derek gave her a sympathetic look. "It won't happen overnight. But with John's connections and the right legal moves, we can push for a retrial. And this time, we'll have all the evidence to show that you didn't deserve this sentence. John's hand tightened on her shoulder. We're going to bring the truth to light, Sarah. I won't let them get away with this. Sarah felt a surge of emotion. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but with John by her side, and Derek's help, maybe, just maybe, they could undo this injustice. As they walked out of the holding area and toward the exit, Sarah's mind was filled with plans, ideas, and a new sense of determination. They had a long road ahead of them, but she wasn't alone. She had her family, her husband, and now a team of people who believed in her. But outside the courtroom, a storm was brewing. The judge who had sentenced her to life without parole was about to find out just how far Sarah's family was willing to go to protect her. John's voice was low, but filled with resolve. This is just the beginning. The power of connections. The following morning, Sarah found herself alone in the small room of her apartment, a place she had once called home. But today, everything felt different. The walls that had once offered comfort now seemed cold and empty. She glanced at her phone, her heart racing with the constant updates she had been receiving throughout the night. News about her case had spread like wildfire. The media was all over it, digging into every detail they could find. They were calling her conviction the result of a racist judge and a flawed justice system. Her husband, John, had been working tirelessly since yesterday. His efforts to reverse the wrongful sentence were already in motion. He had arranged for meetings with high-ranking officials, and Derek, the lawyer, was preparing a strategy to fight back. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The longer she stayed out of the spotlight, the more time her enemies had to plot. The judge, Judge Roberts, wasn't someone who would simply back down. He had a reputation to protect. John arrived at the apartment that morning, as usual, looking sharp and composed, yet something in his eyes revealed the weight he was carrying. He had been working on calls, organizing meetings, and preparing his next steps. But there was a storm brewing, and it was going to hit hard. "Sarah," he said as he walked inside, his face serious but reassuring, "we're going to need to keep our next moves under the radar. The press is going wild, and the more noise we make, the more the judge will try to cover his tracks." Sarah nodded, trying to make sense of everything. "What's the plan now?" "We go straight to the source," John replied. "I've already spoken to a few key people in the city. We've got some powerful allies who are willing to help. But what we need is leverage. We have to find something on Judge Roberts, something that will force him to step back." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Leverage? Against a judge. It sounded dangerous. But at this point, she wasn't sure there was another option. She trusted John, and if he believed this was the only way, she had to support him. They were in this together. "How are we going to find something on him?" Sarah asked, her voice uncertain but determined. "Leave that to me," John said. "I've got connections that Roberts doesn't know about. People who can dig into his past and uncover anything he's been hiding. We'll find something, I promise." But as they spoke, the phone rang, cutting their conversation short. John quickly answered it, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "Yes, I understand. I'll be there in an hour," he said, hanging up the phone. "Who was that?" Sarah asked. "Someone from my office," John replied. "They've uncovered something about Roberts. We need to act fast." Without another word, John grabbed his coat, and they both headed out the door. As they stepped into the car, Sarah's thoughts raced. This was bigger than she had imagined. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing a system of corruption, about bringing someone like Judge Roberts to justice. The drive to John's office felt like a blur. The streets of the city, normally so familiar, now seemed foreign and threatening. They arrived at his office building, and Sarah was immediately taken to a conference room, where a small team of investigators were waiting. John introduced them. "These are the people who are going to help us find out everything we need to know about Roberts. They're experts at digging into people's pasts and finding the truth, no matter how well hidden it is. Sarah nodded, taking a seat at the table. The team quickly got to work, pulling up files and making calls. Sarah was silent, her mind whirling with questions. Would they really be able to find something on the judge? What if they couldn't? As the hours passed, Sarah started to feel more anxious. The team had uncovered several old cases involving Roberts, but none of them seemed to provide the leverage they needed. John paced around the room, looking at the screens, clearly frustrated. But then, one of the investigators looked up from his computer with a look of triumph. "I've got something," the investigator said. "It's not much, but it could be the key." John rushed over. "What did you find?" The investigator pointed to a report on his screen. A case from 10 years ago. Judge Roberts was involved in a controversial decision that many people believe was influenced by outside pressures. There were rumors, but no one could prove anything. But there's one name that keeps coming up. Someone with a lot of power in the city. We need to dig deeper into this. John's eyes sparkled with realization. This is it. This is what we've been looking for. He turned to Sarah, his face serious but hopeful. "We're going to need to dig deeper into this. This could be our way in. If we can prove Roberts was compromised, we'll have him where we want him." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The pieces were starting to come together, but she knew they were walking a dangerous line. One wrong move, and they could all be in deeper trouble. But as long as John was by her side, she wasn't afraid. The dangerous game. As the days passed, Sarah felt a mounting tension she couldn't shake. The deeper she and John got into their investigation, the more dangerous it seemed. Every lead uncovered was another step closer to the truth, but also closer to exposure. Sarah couldn't help but wonder what Roberts and his allies would do if they found out what they were up to. Would they try to stop them? Would they silence them? John, on the other hand, was more focused than ever. He had spent hours with his team, carefully analyzing the evidence they had gathered. The pieces were slowly coming together, and they were starting to see a bigger picture of corruption. Judge Roberts wasn't just a biased judge. He was part of a system that had been manipulating the law for years. Powerful people had been pulling his strings, and now they were all involved in a game far more dangerous than Sarah had ever imagined. "Sarah, you need to stay calm," John said one evening, as they sat in his office, reviewing the latest findings. "I know this is overwhelming, but we're almost there. We've got enough to take Roberts down. We just need to wait for the right moment." But waiting was the hardest part. Every time Sarah thought about her children, she felt a pang of guilt. They had no idea what was happening. They were still at school, unaware that their mother was fighting for her freedom. Would they understand? Would they be proud of her for fighting back, or would they be scared? Meanwhile, the media coverage continued to grow. Sarah's case had become a symbol of the flawed justice system. The news outlets were focused on the story of the black mother who had been wrongfully sentenced to life in prison, while the judge responsible seemed to be getting away with it all. The pressure was mounting, and everyone was watching. Then came the call. It was late in the evening when John's phone rang. Sarah saw the expression on his face change as he answered it. She could feel her heart rate quicken as she waited for him to speak. "Hello," John said, his voice low and tense. There was a pause before he responded, his eyes narrowing. "Where did you hear that?" he asked, the calm in his voice giving way to an edge of anger. He was listening intently, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. Sarah couldn't make out what was being said, but she could sense the gravity of the conversation. John's face was hardening with every word. After a few minutes, John ended the call, throwing the phone on the table in frustration. He stood up, pacing the room. "John, what's going on?" Sarah asked, her anxiety rising. "It's worse than we thought," John said, his voice tense. "Someone from the inside has tipped Roberts off. He knows we're digging into his past, and he's already making moves to cover his tracks." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What does that mean? What are they going to do?" John turned to her, his face grim. "It means they're coming after us. I don't know how far they'll go, but they'll do whatever it takes to protect Roberts and keep the truth from coming out." Sarah's mind raced. This was exactly what she had feared. But she wasn't going to let fear control her. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. She had to stand her ground, no matter the cost. "We can't back down now," she said, her voice firm. "If we stop now, everything we've done will be for nothing. We have to keep pushing forward." John nodded, though his concern was evident. "I agree, but we need to be careful. We're up against powerful people, and they won't hesitate to destroy anyone in their way." Sarah understood the danger, but she also knew she had to trust John. He was the one with the experience and the connections, and he was determined to see this through. She had to believe that, together, they could bring down the corrupt system that had stolen so much from them. The next few days were a blur of meetings and phone calls. John worked tirelessly to track down the people who had been feeding Roberts information. They knew the clock was ticking. The more time they wasted, the more likely it was that Roberts and his allies would take steps to erase the evidence or destroy any chance of exposing the truth. Then came a breakthrough. One of John's informants had uncovered a meeting between Judge Roberts and several powerful figures, businessmen, politicians, and even law enforcement officers, who were involved in manipulating cases for personal gain. They had been working together for years, and their ties were deep. This was the kind of information that could bring everything crashing down. But it wasn't enough just to have the information. They needed proof, something concrete that could stand up in court. And that's where things got tricky. The people involved were careful. They covered their tracks. They were not going to let anyone expose their operations without a fight. John had one plan left, a plan so risky that it could either make or break their case. He was going to get inside the circle, get the proof they needed, and expose everything before it was too late. "We can't let them win," John said, determination in his eyes. "We'll get the proof, and then we'll make sure everyone knows what kind of people they really are." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their mission. This wasn't just about her freedom anymore. This was about justice for everyone who had been hurt by the corruption of the system. But she also knew one thing for sure. They had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The undercover operation. The plan was risky, too risky, in Sarah's eyes. But there was no other way. John had spent days preparing, gathering intel, and organizing everything. He had to go undercover, infiltrate the group of people behind Roberts, and get the proof they needed to expose the corruption. It was a dangerous game, one where the stakes were life and death. Sarah couldn't shake the fear that gripped her heart as she watched John leave for the operation. She knew he was doing it for the right reasons, but the idea of him putting himself in harm's way terrified her. She had already lost so much, and she couldn't imagine losing him too. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice cracking as she spoke. "I will," John replied with a reassuring smile, though she could see the tension in his eyes. He wasn't fooling her. He knew the risks better than anyone. But he had to do this. There was no other choice. John's plan was simple, but the execution was anything but. He had to gain the trust of the key players in the criminal network, the ones pulling the strings behind Judge Roberts. He had to make them believe that he was one of them, that he was loyal. It was a delicate balance, and one wrong move could cost him everything. As he made his way to the meeting point, his mind raced. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The group he was infiltrating was dangerous. They had ties to powerful figures, and their reach was far and wide. One slip-up could mean not only the end of John's career, but also Sarah's freedom, and maybe even their lives. Meanwhile, Sarah sat at home, unable to focus on anything. Her thoughts were consumed by the weight of what was happening. The tension between them was palpable. She had never felt so helpless. She couldn't do anything to help John, couldn't be there to watch his back. All she could do was wait. The hours dragged on. Sarah paced back and forth, checking her phone every few minutes, hoping for an update. any sign that John was safe. But as the night grew darker, her anxiety only deepened. Was John okay? Was he in danger? She needed to hear from him, needed to know that he was still in one piece. Then the phone rang. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she rushed to answer it. Her hands trembled as she pressed the phone to her ear, hoping against hope that it was John. "Sarah," John's voice crackled through the phone. "I'm in. I've made contact." Relief washed over her, but she knew this was just the beginning. John had gained their trust, but now came the hard part, getting the evidence. He had to be patient, stay in character, and wait for the right moment. Every conversation, every interaction, was a calculated risk. "We're getting close," John continued, his voice low and urgent. "But they're watching me closely. I can't slip up. They're ruthless." Sarah's heart tightened at the mention of the word ruthless. She had seen firsthand what these people were capable of. Roberts was just the tip of the iceberg. There were far more dangerous people involved, people who would stop at nothing to protect their empire. "Be careful," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't afford to lose you." "I won't let that happen," John promised, his tone firm. "We'll get the truth out. I won't stop until we do." The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. She tried to distract herself, but every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed ominous. Every creak in the house made her heart race. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about justice. The stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences of failure were too terrible to imagine. Meanwhile, John was inside the belly of the beast. "Did anyone see him leave?" one of them asked, his voice low but sharp. "No," another voice replied, "but we should check the security footage. Something feels off." John's heart raced. He had to get out, and fast. Without thinking, he ducked into a janitor's closet just as the footsteps drew closer. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't find him. His hands gripped the briefcase tightly, the cold metal of the lock biting into his fingers. The voices grew louder, and John knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered his disappearance. He had no choice but to wait until they passed. The minutes felt like hours, but eventually, the footsteps faded, and the building grew quiet again. With a final glance over his shoulder, John pushed open the closet door and stepped out. He moved quickly toward the back exit, praying that he wasn't too late. When he finally reached the alley, the cold night air hit him like a punch. He could see his car in the distance, parked under a flickering streetlight. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, but he kept his pace steady, focused. He couldn't afford to be reckless now. As he reached the car, a sudden sense of relief washed over him. He was almost there, almost safe. But just as he was about to open the door, a shout broke the silence. "Hey, stop right there." John's heart skipped a beat. He turned around to see two men running toward him, their figures silhouetted in the dim light. His mind raced. There was no time to think. The men were too close. Without a second thought, John jumped into the car, slamming the door shut behind him. He didn't waste a moment. He started the engine and peeled out of the alley, tires screeching as he accelerated. Behind him, he could hear the sound of footsteps and yelling, but it didn't matter now. He had to go. He had to get to Sarah. John didn't look back as he sped through the streets, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The city was quiet at this hour, but that made him even more nervous. He could feel the tension building, the sense of being hunted. The briefcase sat on the passenger seat, a constant reminder of how close he was to achieving everything they had fought for. As he drove, John's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Sarah. "John, are you okay? Please text me." His fingers trembled as he pulled over to the side of the road and quickly typed a response. "I'm almost there. Don't worry. I have everything we need." He hit send, then stuffed the phone back into his pocket. He had to focus. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Minutes later, John arrived at the safe house. He parked the car behind a large building, making sure no one would be able to follow him. The last thing he needed was for anyone to know where he was. He grabbed the briefcase and rushed to the door. Inside, Sarah was waiting for him. Her eyes scanned him frantically as he entered, her face filled with worry. "John, you're safe." "I'm fine," he said, trying to reassure her, but the exhaustion in his voice gave him away. He had barely made it out in one piece, and the danger wasn't over yet. "I have everything. We can expose them. It's all in here." He set the briefcase down on the table, his hand still shaking as he opened it. The files inside were neatly stacked, ready to be used. As Sarah flipped through the papers, John stood by, watching her every move. They had come so far, but now, with the evidence in hand, the real fight was just beginning. The final showdown. The clock was ticking. John and Sarah stood at the table, the briefcase between them. Each paper inside represented a chance to expose the powerful figures who had worked together to ruin innocent lives, including Sarah's. But they knew it was not enough to just have the evidence. They had to make it public. The only problem was, the group was already closing in on them. "John, what if we don't make it out of here?" Sarah asked, her voice low but filled with worry. She had seen the men chasing John through the alleyway, and she knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they were after. "We will," John replied, his voice steady but with an edge of uncertainty. "We have no choice. We can't let them get away with this. They've ruined too many lives already." John's thoughts raced. The stakes had never been higher, and with every passing minute, their enemies were getting closer. He had to think fast, but nothing seemed like a sure bet. There was no backup plan, only one chance to expose the truth. Suddenly, the sound of tires screeching outside broke his concentration. Sarah tensed up, looking through the window. A black SUV had pulled up right in front of the house. John's pulse quickened. "They're here," he muttered under his breath. Sarah's eyes widened. She grabbed the briefcase and looked at John with a determination he hadn't seen before. "We don't have much time. We can't let them get inside." John quickly grabbed his phone and sent a message to a trusted journalist he had met earlier in the investigation. It was their only hope. If they could get the story out to the public, it would be impossible for the corrupt group to silence them. But even if the journalist got the message, there was still a huge risk. What if they couldn't get the evidence out in time? Just as he hit send, there was a loud bang at the door. John's heart skipped a beat. The group had found them. "We have to go," John said urgently, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her towards the back exit. They ran through the hallway, their footsteps muffled by the sound of the heavy rain outside. The back door swung open, and John motioned for Sarah to go first. He followed closely behind her, not daring to look back. They raced down the alley, but as they neared the end, John's worst fear came true. Another SUV, this one with tinted windows, had blocked their path. "John," Sarah gasped, grabbing his arm. "What do we do now?" John's mind was racing. There was no escape. The group had them trapped. But then, John noticed something, a figure standing in the shadows. It was the journalist he had sent the message to earlier. She had come, just as they had planned. "Quick, get in the car," the journalist shouted. "I've got the story ready to go. I just need to get the evidence." Without hesitating, John and Sarah climbed into the journalist's car, the briefcase clutched tightly between them. As they sped away from the alley, John looked out the back window. He could see the two SUVs chasing them, but there was nothing they could do now. The truth was out. They had done everything they could. The car flew down the wet streets, turning corners with sharp precision. The journalist didn't stop. She drove like her life depended on it. And it did. As they reached the highway, she pulled into a secluded area, away from any prying eyes. "All right," the journalist said, breathing heavily. "I've got everything. I'll make sure it gets to the right people. You two just need to stay out of sight for a while." John and Sarah nodded, finally able to exhale. They had done it. The truth was going to be exposed, and there was no turning back now. But just as the journalist started to leave, John received another message on his phone. His heart dropped as he read it. "We know what you did. Don't think you've won. We'll come for you." The message was from one of the men who had been chasing them. The threat was clear. The group wasn't finished yet. John's hand clenched around his phone. They had won this battle. But the war was far from over. The corrupt group would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And now, John and Sarah had become their targets. "We can't stop now," John said, looking at Sarah with determination in his eyes. "We have to make sure this gets out. And once it does, there's no going back." Sarah nodded, her face a mixture of fear and resolve. They knew the dangers that lay ahead, but they also knew that exposing the truth was the only way to end the corruption and injustice. With the journalists' help, their fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.